Hello. I'm grateful for the opportunity to take part in the conference here in Leiden, and I would, as last paper, like to add one more location to our discussion, the political cultural landscape of Israel. Like many other places, Israel too is experiencing a flow of new museums and memorials, and I believe that the role of museums in the nation-building process can't be considered separately from that of memorials. To answer questions such as whose heritage and whose memory is it anyway, we need to take into account processes of creating and reinforcing a national narrative and collective memory as is done by the Israeli government. The complex Israeli national narrative is largely the Zionist story. The collective memory consequently deals largely with the devotion and sacrifices this involved. And starting even before the establishment of the state in 1948, every new museum has had to deal with the question of whether to relate to the Zionist narrative or to another narrative. The answer depends on the political position or aspirations of the museum founders. After the last election in March 2015, Netanyahu, the prime minister and head of the Likud party, succeeded in establishing a hardcore right-wing government with a one-seat majority. Miri Regev joined Likud in 2009 and is since March 2015 Minister of Culture and Sport. She comes from a family of Moroccan immigrants and served 25 years in the army, including as chief spokesperson. She has made the government's conservative shift very apparent in cultural policy. Among other things, Regev recently proposed a loyalty in culture bill that would authorize her to cut funding to institutions that attack Israel and its symbols. Regev is frequently in the news, and just last Tuesday, and after that I stopped checking the news, an article mentioned her as the only possible successor to Netanyahu. In March of this year, at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, Haaretz, a liberal newspaper, had organized a conference addressing the interplay of state funding and cultural production and had invited Regev. I would like to show how she addresses the museum's auditorium filled with artists, actors, and writers.
אמרו לי תמיד להתחיל בציטטה. זה עושה רושם תרבותי. אז קבלו. כמו שאמר פעם פילוסוף סיני ידוע, סנצ'ו, cut זה בולשיט! cut זה בולשיט!
And especially her expression afterwards. I thought of that with yesterday's speaker, the importance of sound, and only when I heard her say it after I have read it, I thought I have to show you this. So in July, artists, museum directors, and educators filed a lawsuit against the ministry due to increased threats to freedom of speech. The protest comes mostly from art institutions. It seems that ethnographic and migration museums haven't changed their policies, choosing instead to continue to promote distortions of their own narratives that they hope will be accepted as part of the national narrative. So the question of what role ethnographic museums can play in fashioning a more convivial policies seems at present not relevant for Israel. Rather, the question that should be asked is whether belonging remains a goal worth striving for. And today I will look at two existing ethnographic museum collections, that of the Bedouin and Iraqi group, and two currently in formation, that of the Israeli Arab and the Ethiopian group, for discussion of current debates regarding questions of citizenship and belonging in Israel. These unlabeled tanks, shown already in the background of the first slide, are the first objects you see when you visit Al-Badia, a site of 1,000 square meters that includes a monument to the fallen Bedouin soldiers and a Bedouin Heritage Center. It's located in the Galilee. And although surrounded by Bedouin villages, the site itself is a neutral place that doesn't belong to any of the Bedouin communities, preventing control by any one extended family. About 1/5 of the Muslim Arabs in Israel are Bedouin, an Arab semi-nomadic group of tribes. And unlike most Muslim Arabs, the Bedouin community allows its sons to volunteer for military service in Israel, which they have done in large numbers. And while the southern Bedouin of the Negev desert are ambivalent about the state of Israel, the northern Bedouin of the Galilee identify with it almost fully. And because of their participation in the IDF, they have come to be viewed by Jewish Israeli society as a separate, non-Arab minority group loyal to the state. They don't ignore their own heritage and memory, rather they make far-reaching adjustments to their way of memorializing it in order to fit into the national Israeli and sometimes even Jewish heritage and collective memory. The founder of this site is Mr. Ziad Saidi. He was born in 1958 in Haifa. He went to Jewish high school, where he experienced Memorial Day, the day of remembrance for the fallen soldiers of Israel. His father died while serving as a border guard when Saidi was 12 years old, and he couldn't understand why there were no memorial ceremonies for his father. In the 80s, during a meeting he organized with Bedouin families and a representative from the Prime Minister's office, it was agreed to establish such a memorial. This resulted in the Wall of Tears monument, in which the names of Bedouin who fell in the service of their country are engraved. There are 2 citations, lines from an early 20th century Hebrew poem by a Jewish poet, and Al-Fatiha, the first sentence of the Quran. The monument was unveiled in 1993 in a ceremony attended by then Prime Minister and Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin. 3 years later, at the request of their families, the names of the fallen southern Bedouin were added, and it became a national monument. Ziad didn't stop here. He added more monuments, including a memorial wall without names, identical to those found in Jewish cemeteries. And in 2009, he established the Bedouin Heritage Center, funded by the Ministry of Tourism. The goal to exhibit the covenant of blood and covenant of life between the Bedouins and the State of Israel. The Jewish Orit Shacham Gofer wrote the text and established the collection. The exhibition area consists of a dark winter tent and a bright summer tent. The winter tent holds objects connected to the Bedouin culture and their nomadic way of life. And the summer tent relates to the survival and fighting capabilities of the Bedouin and the uniqueness of the Bedouin fighter. And it's not a coincidence that the army uniform is the last thing you see before leaving the Heritage Center, just as the tanks at the entrance to the site are not as neutral as the absence of a label might suggest. In 1996, Said Abu Shakra established the Al-Fahim Gallery of Art in Al-Fahim, the second largest Muslim Arab town in Israel. He's from a family of many artists, and he too studied art in college. But for 25 years, he worked with the Israeli police force and painting in his free time. And this is one of his own paintings. Now retired, he devotes his time to the gallery. And 2 years earlier, while attending the opening of an exhibition of works by his late cousin Assam Abu Shakra, he asked himself why the Tel Aviv Museum of Art was the first museum to honor his cousin. He decided to open an art gallery in Al-Fahim in the hope of educating a new generation capable of studying art and representing its own culture. He managed to receive some funding from the Ministry of Education and Culture and from the municipality, whose mayor, Sheikh Raid Salet, was also the head of the Islamic movement in Israel. In 2006, during a fundraising event at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, Said announced the start of a museum of contemporary art in Al-Fahim. Tal Ben Tzvi, a Jewish expert on Palestinian art, would design a collection plan. The permanent collection of the future museum would consist of 60% Palestinian art, and the remaining 40% would be the Israeli international art. The one concession the gallery made to Islamic rules was to keep out nudity. 10 years later, the model of the future museum, designed by Jewish architects, is but an object exhibited on the second floor of the gallery. Abu Shakra had trouble raising the necessary funds. He intended that 40% of the funds would come from Arab donors, but he found that few were willing to donate to an institution in Israel. He decided instead to renovate the gallery and to get it recognized as a museum. The collection now consists of 400 works, and 6 months ago some were exhibited as an introduction to Palestinian art. The official opening of the renovated gallery was only 2 weeks ago, and the invitation read, "We were honored to be supported by the Ministry of Culture, the Lottery, the local community, and our advisory board in Israel and the United States who made this change possible." And the artist whose work was exhibited to mark this important point in the history of the Al-Fahim Art Gallery is the Jewish Gershon Knipsel. Meanwhile, in May, the inauguration of the building of the first Palestinian museum opened in Birzeit in the West Bank. The core of the museum will be the history and culture of Palestinian society. And when its director, Omar Akaten, was asked about the Al-Fahim Gallery, he said, "I think that we have a very powerful, very rich and diverse culture, and it should be one that measures itself against human history in general, and not within the narrative of nationalism or Zionism." A museum that has existed for years and that from the start made an explicit effort to become part of the Zionist narrative is the Babylonian Jewry Heritage Center in Or Yehuda, a city near Tel Aviv, where many Iraqi immigrants were housed in transit camps. And next to the museum stands a monument to the memory of Iraqi Jewish martyrs. With the beginning of the Arab revolt in Palestine of 1936, the security of the Jews in Iraq was undermined, and in 1941 pogroms killed 180 Jews. In 1948, following the establishment of the State of Israel, thousands of Iraqi Jews were imprisoned. And in 1950, the Iraqi government gave permission to the Jews to immigrate on condition that they renounce their Iraqi citizenship and relinquish their property. And by the time the law expired on March 8, 1951, nearly 105,000 Jews had immigrated to Israel, while over 15,000 more had left the country illegally. And although it was indeed a case of rescue immigration, they had not needed to be rescued until they registered to leave Iraq. And whereas Israel expected them to be grateful, the Iraqi Jews expected Israeli society to recognize and appreciate the sacrifice they had made. Despite this discrepancy in perception and a difficult beginning, 20 years after their mass immigration, Iraqi Jews were considered to be the best integrated of the Americans from Islamic countries. Well established and secure in their status, a group of activists began to criticize the neglect of their community by the Israeli establishment. In 1973, they founded the Babylonian Jewry Heritage Center, both a research center and a museum. The leading figure, who you can see here, was Mordechai Ben Porat, who in Iraq had been in charge of the operation of bringing immigrants to Israel and subsequently served as mayor of Or Yehuda and as a member of parliament. As mayor, he made the decision that all tribes in Or Yehuda should have the opportunity to exhibit their culture. The land needed for this purpose should be a gift from the municipality. And in 1968, a monument was unveiled on this land, commemorating heroes of the Zionist underground movement in Iraq. The fact that the first Iraqi memorial was to executed fighters and not to the pogrom victims shows the emphasis on the Zionist narrative. This is here. The museum collection, the largest collection of material of the Iraqi Jewish community in the world, consists of both ethnography and art. The chief curator told me that one of the goals is to raise the pride of Iraqi Jews by showing their story. And the museum building in itself is proof that the difficult beginning is in the past and the group is now in a position to show their heritage. Construction was only completed in 2014 due to the government delay in transferring funds for a second floor. And during a parliamentary committee meeting to discuss the problem, committee member Avner Shaki noted that communities that came out of Europe organized themselves very well over the years and established institutions to preserve their heritage, whereas the immigrants from the Eastern European countries have only recently begun to search for their origins and roots, saying, "Anyone who has no past has no future." This same expression is heard when discussing the Ethiopian heritage in Israel. Following the establishment of the state, the government did not include the Ethiopian Jews in its efforts to encourage immigration. In 1974, political unrest and famine led Ethiopians to begin to flee. Ethiopian Jews chose to walk to Sudan, hoping to reach Israel. And due to severe circumstances of the journey, an estimated 4,000 perished. In 2007, a memorial was established in the National Civil Cemetery on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. In Sudan, the Jews were placed in refugee camps, and in two secret operations, the Israeli authorities airlifted Ethiopian Jews from Sudan in 1984-85 and from Addis Ababa in 1991. The Ethiopian community in Israel now numbers over 138,000. The government initially adopted an unprecedented policy that new immigrants could, by disregarding their heritage, hasten their absorption into Israeli society. This policy was only to Ethiopians who were considered refugees despite their own view to the contrary. It did not lead to the desired outcome, and the integration of Ethiopian Jews in Israel has been far from successful. This is the monument. 30 years later, the government has reversed itself and now, in line with the older generation of the Ethiopian Jewish community, asserts that denial of heritage actually hurt their absorption. The government now believes that the solution to the absorption problem is to acknowledge the heritage. And this is another new phenomenon in Israel politics. Never before was an immigrant group encouraged to retroactively root back or to emphasize their pre-Israeli culture of origins, practices, and languages. And this is reflected in comments by Member of Parliament Mula, himself an Ethiopian immigrant, regarding the importance of passing the Center of Ethiopian Jewish Heritage Law. He says, "Only such a center can ensure a proper appreciation of the community's behavior, and the center initiated by Akala was approved in 2012. A center that is being created to share the incredible traditions of Ethiopian Jewry with the people in Israel and across the Jewish world, according to Simcha Ketanu of the public committee behind the project. No budget was allocated till this past June, when Minister Regev announced the allocation of funds for the center, and she stated, "The Ethiopians have been discriminated against, like all the black people in our country, the Haredim, ultra-Orthodox who wear black, Arabs, and Jews from Arab countries. The time for black has arrived. You and I are proud to be black." To sum up, Israel's right-wing government has changed the political cultural landscape, emphasizing the need for groups to promote their own heritage. However, the heritage has to be, from the outset, unquestionably connected to the Zionist narrative. That way, the group presents itself as equal partners, with a valid claim to the Zionist narrative, and not as victims that had to be rescued. As we see, this was done by the Iraqi population and might help explain their successful integration. The Ethiopian immigrants, on the other hand, with the encouragement of the government, emphasized the Zionist aspect, but marginalized their own heritage. And not only is their integration a failure, new attempts by both the government and the group itself to present the heritage have not been fruitful. Even an Arab Muslim minority group like the Bedouin can be almost fully integrated in the Israel national narrative and be part of its collective memory as long as it pretends not to be Arab. And finally, an Arab modern art museum can get funding as long as it shows Israeli Jewish art. Within each group, only a certain, even smaller part will feel connected to this version of the heritage exhibited. And when you are being forced to tell only certain aspects of your story to accommodate the government narrative, the question arises as to what extent you want to adjust who you are. What happens if belonging is not something worth striving for anymore? What happens when there is no room anymore to belong, but when you are still present? And while I was thinking about these questions, I read last week's column by Said Kashua. Kashua is a renowned Israeli Arab author who writes in Hebrew and has a weekly column in Haaretz. 2 years ago, he moved to the States, and for his readers, his departure symbolized the country's decline into angry factionalism. The column he wrote just after the winner of the elections in the state was announced. He says, "One of our declared intentions was that we no longer wanted to feel that we belong. The idea was to live in a place where by design we would be foreigners, in the hope of finding an alternative home where the children's foreignness would be more tolerated. We were ready to delude ourselves to the point of foregoing national, cultural, and religious identity, with the aim of integrating the children into a culture that we hoped, in vain, would be ready to accepting them, at least as individuals. When do you know that it's time to get up and leave?" Thank you.